We are about to commence today's program, the Ideashala, which is an initiative of Takshashila Institution. Today's Ideashala on evolving dynamics of India-China relations is jointly organized by Indian Council of World Affairs and Takshashila Institution. Please allow me to brief you about today's program. Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, will make opening remarks, which will be followed by introductory remarks by Sri Nitin Pai, co-founder and director, Takshashila Institution. Thereafter, two presentations will be made. Dr. Anirudh Kanisetti from Takshashila Institution will speak on the Kra Canal, what does it mean for India. And the second presenter, Mr. Manoj Kewalramani from Takshashila Institution will speak on 5G, Huawei and geopolitics. After these two presentations, there will be a panel discussion which will be moderated by Ms. Suhasini Haidar, Diplomatic and Strategic Editor of The Hindu. Panelists are Dr. Jabin Jacob, Associate Professor from Srinagar University, and the two paper presenters. We plan to conclude the session by 11:30. After this session, there will be a tea break, and then there will be three parallel breakout sessions. Dr. Amjad Ali Khan, convener of Ideashala, will make some announcement regarding the three breakout sessions at the end of the program. Thank you. Now, may I now invite Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, DG ICWA, to kindly deliver his opening remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, dear colleagues on the dais. It's a great pleasure for the ICWA to be jointly hosting this today's program with Takshashila, and I would like to congratulate Nitin Pai and all his colleagues for putting this discussion together. I'm very happy to see some new faces apart from the regular members of the council, and I thought I would begin with, or I would not really touch on the subjects which we will hear a great deal about, but tell you a little bit about the ICWA, because in a way this joint program is important for us. The ICWA is certainly India's, possibly Asia's oldest think tank. It was set up in the early 1940s when a group of intellectuals felt that it was important that India, as it moved towards freedom, develop an independent perspective on global affairs. And out of that initiative, which was spearheaded by Tej Bahadur Sapru, the Indian Council of World Affairs emerged. And over the years, it has played a foundational role in the development of an independent narrative on India and the world. So we've had a journal which has been running continuously since the mid-1940s. It has a wonderful library, possibly the finest collection of books you will find on global affairs of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, up to the 1970s and 80s when the internet age took over, is housed in our collections. We have a large research faculty and so on. So I'm delighted to welcome all of those who have not been to Sapru House before, and I do hope you will continue to come. It's a publicly funded institution, so our mandate really is to reach out to members of the public. So the library is open access, anyone can become a member. All our programs and discussions are open to the public. So please do try to keep in touch with us. I'm very happy that we are doing this with Takshashila, which is one of the, now not so, but at one time was one of the newer public policy institutions in India. So this synergy between the old and the new, I hope it is certainly good for the ICWA, and I do hope it is also good for Takshashila. I know we have a lot to discuss, and I'm very grateful that all of you have come here today, Suhasini, Dr. Jacob, the other colleagues present here. It's a subject which Ambassador Smita Purushottam was telling me this morning is vital, very important. And I think 5G especially is an area where technology, geopolitics and foreign policy converges in a very focused way. An absence of domain knowledge could have major consequences as we move towards the future. So this discussion, as also that on the Kra Canal, is really very timely. I don't wish to take up too much time. So may I again thank all of you for your presence here and say that I greatly look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Mr. Nitin Pai, Director, Takshashila Institution, to kindly give his introductory remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. It's an absolute delight to be here in the presence of Ambassador Raghavan because he has been instrumental in the setting up of Takshashila. When he was High Commissioner to Singapore, I was there. We were contemporaries in Singapore. He was in government, I was in the Singapore government. And when I first told him that, you know, I'm thinking of moving back and setting up Takshashila, he was amazed, he was delighted. And just the expression on his face at that time was a massive source of encouragement to me to say that, look, we are doing something right here. So thank you, sir, for that. A quick word about Takshashila as I welcome you. We are a unique institution in the sense that just as how Sapru House was born at a time when people were wondering what does independent India do in the realm of foreign affairs, and there is a need for intellectual development of that space. We were born at a time when India was on its verge of coming out of being a third world country and seen as an emerging country, emerging economy and an emerging power. And what does an emerging power do? How do we define our interests in this new world in the 21st century, and how do we promote our interests in this 21st century? So that was the thought process behind the creation of Takshashila. We are a three-faced organization. We are a school of public policy, which works with people like you, smart, dynamic people around the world who want to get an education in public policy. We are largely online, so both faculty and students could be anywhere and still participate in the conversation. We are a research institution, we are a think tank, engaged in understanding India's engagement with the world. We work on foreign affairs, public economics, and technology and politics, some of which you will see today. And we are also an outreach organization, because I think one of the reasons you cannot contribute to the intellectual discourse in a country until you are out of academia and in the public discourse. And that's a very challenging balance to maintain, because you have to be rigorous to satisfy the requirements of academia, but you have to be approachable and readable and understandable to the intelligent people in the public space. So that's a challenge that we're trying to balance all the time. So this is what Takshashila is around. We've been around for 10 years now. That seems like a long time. And we're based in Bangalore. A little bit about Ideashala. The Ideashala is an attempt to bridge 3Gs. You know, it's a 3G. The first bridge is across generations. So I'm so happy that we are here. We are bridging generations. There are 3 generations of thoughtful people here. And it's an attempt for us to learn from each other, in all directions. It's a bridge across geographies. So we're trying to get people from around the world, around India, to be in the conversation. And if I were to use a word, it's also try to bridge across gharanas, because there are schools of thought in international relations, which I think there is a need for all these schools of thought to meet at some common place and have discussions, disagreements, and common ways forward. So that's the genesis of the idea of the Ideashala, and we're so happy that it's this audience here sort of proves that we're trying, we're on our way to bridge these 3 things. The last point I want to make is with respect to the points of view. I don't want to have an academic conversation on the liberal school of thought and the realist school of thought and constructivism and Marxism and all of that. But if you look at India and the way India looks at foreign policy, the tradition largely has been, it's a Delhi-centric continental perspective. And Ambassador Raghavan here has written a lot about the balancing of the continental and the maritime perspectives. So he's brought in the idea that there is a maritime perspective, there's a maritime view of India that is important. But that's one, looking at one bridge. The other one is the Delhi perspective versus the distance from Delhi perspective. If you go to Calcutta, if you go to Tamil Nadu, you go to Bangalore, in Mumbai, in Bihar, you will have ideas, world views of what they think of a foreign policy. It might be a very neighborhood-related issue, but it is still an issue which animates their domestic politics. It is of interest to the citizens of India. And it's not just the traditional, state-to-state relations which come into the domain of foreign policy. The second bridge is private institutions, corporations, firms have a worldview, have an interest in foreign affairs. Individuals, NGOs, non-profit organizations have interest in worldviews and a voice in foreign affairs. These interests also should come into our mainstream conversations, and we'll be richer for it if we can incorporate all of these. And last point I want to make is, there is also a if you look at a political center of foreign policy, it's no doubt Delhi. If you look at the economic center of foreign policy, it's somewhere Delhi, Bombay, Mumbai, and to some extent Bangalore. And then there's a geotechnological perspective, which is Bangalore, Delhi, and to some extent Hyderabad and other places. So there are all these elements of international relations, versions and interpretations of national interests that are floating around. And the Ideashala is our attempt to try and bring as much of this together as possible and put it in front of this 3G audience. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the Takshashila family. We hope this is the first step in a longer and a continuous engagement with all of you. Welcome to Takshashila.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Madam Suhasini Haidar to kindly conduct the proceedings now, the presentations and the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you've taken a look at the program, and you know that a large part of this discussion will be led by you and your questions, so please keep them ready. I think we're going to start first with two presentations. Can I ask Anirudh to come first? And here it is. Anirudh is going to talk about the Kra Canal and what it means for India.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Ambassador Raghavan, and thank you for the introduction, Nitin. So what I'm going to be broadly speaking about today is what the Kra Canal means for India. So let me just introduce you to something that we do at Takshashila called the reverse Bollywood format, where we present to you the ending of the presentation in the very beginning. So these are the three key ideas that I'm going to be addressing through my talk. The very first is this. Despite the fact that I'm going to be ostensibly talking about the Kra Canal, I'm going to start by telling you that I don't think the Kra Canal is going to materialize anytime soon. The second is that though the Kra Canal is very often seen as one of the pearls in China's so-called necklace of pearls, which is supposedly stringing around India, it's not necessarily aimed at us, and it could definitely impact our interests, but it could also possibly serve them. The third, if the Kra Canal were to be built, if India were to want to benefit from the canal, there's three things that we have to start doing right away. The first is developing transshipment facilities on India's east coast and integrating them with inland logistics systems. The second is to lay out a capacity map to use the Andaman Islands for surveillance and sea denial capabilities. And the third is to make sure that any multilateral initiatives on the Kra Canal are indefinitely delayed. And I'll explain why through this presentation. So let's begin by looking at the Malacca Strait. So the Malacca Strait is by far one of the world's most important choke points. I believe about 40% of global trade goes through this particular region here. In 2017, 100,000 ships actually traveled this canal, and it's believed that by 2024 maximum, this canal is going to reach its maximum capacity. So it's also quite interesting for China because I think President Hu Jintao once described it as China's Malacca dilemma. Considering that only over 80% of China's energy imports go through this particular region, it's a massive security problem for them. But they also have economic interests in this particular choke point. Over 64% of their trade goes through this particular route that I've highlighted here. So one might ask, if by 2024 the Kra Canal is jam-packed, how exactly do we continue to use this for maritime traffic? And the answer to that is possibly to route traffic down this way around the island of Sumatra and through the Sunda Strait. But considering that your distance is going to be far longer, is going to be a much more expensive route, and also the terrain around Sumatra here is relatively marshy and could be amenable to piratical activities. Which brings up the question of what can we possibly do to make global trade still continue to flow through this region easily enough? And the answer to that is by building a canal. So this canal would be through the Isthmus of Kragh in southern Thailand, which would massively save transit time and cost. And considering that it's mostly been proposed by Chinese players recently, it's believed that it could possibly solve China's Malacca dilemma by routing their energy imports through something that they personally control. Of course, this is not really a very new idea. The idea actually originates in the 17th century with this very interesting character called Narai, the king of Thailand, who exchanged embassies with Louis XIV, the king of France. Very interesting character. You should definitely read up about him. But what happened during his reign is that Narai wanted to build a canal that would enable him to get his troops from Thailand around the Isthmus of Kragh and into Burma, which he was, a rival of his. But that proposal didn't really materialize because they didn't have the technological capabilities at that point. But the technological capabilities seemed to exist in the 19th century, which, as you'll know, was also famous for the great canal building projects of Panama and Suez. So the idea was that if you build a canal here, then the idea was the French would build a canal through Kragh, and that would be used by the Thai and the French people to get trade through and so on and so forth. This obviously didn't go down very well with our friends, the British, since they controlled Singapore, and Singapore at that time dominated the Straits of Malacca. So what happened was that there was an arrangement reached between the British and the Thai governments that allowed Thailand to basically take control of this region here, as you can see, which was basically a region dominated by Malay Muslims, whereas the majority of Thailand, as you know, is ruled by Thai Buddhists. And because of this arrangement being reached, what happened was that the Thai government realized that they didn't really have a pressing need to build the canal, and that led to it being rather unceremoniously cancelled. Moving on. I'll actually come back to the reason why this is important in a couple of slides. So as we can see, in the 19th century, Britain and France had a problem over Kragh. In the 20th century, American think tanks were quite obsessed with the idea of Japan building a canal through there. And as you can see, today in the 21st century, this Indian think tank is quite obsessed with the idea of China building a canal through that. So what really is new about this? Why are we so concerned about it? Well, in 2015, a Chinese private company and a Thai private institution signed an MOU saying that they would do a feasibility study over the canal. So let me just briefly take you through the way that the Thais and the Chinese are thinking about it. Let's look at Thailand first, right? So the first argument put forth is that building this canal would transform Thailand's economy. I'm sure that all of us know that Thailand is really dependent on tourism for most of its economy. But if you were to build a canal, Thailand would suddenly become a global shipping and financial logistics center, which would be great for Thailand. It would also create tons of jobs. It would bring a lot of people out of poverty, which would arguably lead to a lot more social stability. And most importantly, having control over this new geopolitical choke point would make Thailand a new swing power in Southeast Asia. Now, as you'll see, there's good counter-arguments to every single one of these. The very first is, even if you were to build a canal, would it necessarily make Thailand a great economic and transshipment hub? Because it would still have to compete with Singapore. And Singapore has the institutions, as I'm sure both Ambassador Raghavan and Nitin can attest. Singapore's spent decades building up the institutions and the infrastructure needed to make it a globally competitive port. For Thailand to do something similar, estimates range from around $30 to $80 billion of investment over the next few years, which is a massive cost that Thais would incur, with no guarantee that the canal would be able to pay for itself. Second, there's also massive security implications. If you were to build a canal that separates the southern part of Thailand, where, as we said, there's a lot of Malay Muslims, that separates it from the mainland, as it were, it would be a massive national security risk for the Thais. And third, having a canal that's ostensibly built by the Chinese that you owe the Chinese for is going to make the Thais vulnerable to Chinese influence in a lot of ways that they might not necessarily want, and risk bringing them into a US-China escalation or confrontation if it happens in this region. With that said, it seems like this is a great idea for China, right? I mean, if you look at these 3 points, the first is from the Chinese perspective, if you build a canal through Kragh, it will solve your energy dilemma, the so-called Malacca dilemma. It would guarantee you access to the Indian Ocean at any time you want. It would also boost your exports and business immensely because you're reducing the travel distance by about 1,200 kilometers or about 3 days. And also it would bolster China's claim of being a provider of so-called global public goods, as they put it, and improve their relations with certain ASEAN countries. But again, as with Thailand, there's also counter-arguments for China, which we'll see here. First is, it's a massive investment, right? As I said, $30 to $80 billion is not a small amount of money even for the Chinese. Second, considering the wide array of views that the Thais hold about the canal, there's a risk that it could be cancelled at some point after it's initiated, which would incur massive losses for the Chinese. Third, though you're building a canal that's ostensibly meant to solve your Malacca dilemma, you're also building something that's very, very vulnerable to being blockaded by Indian ships. So would you be necessarily solving your Malacca dilemma or creating a Malacca dilemma, as it were? The third, though China might think that is bolstering the narrative of global public goods, there's also a risk that it would feed into the broader narrative of the Chinese debt trap that it's sucking all these other countries into, which might be problematic for them going forward. And finally, though it would definitely improve their relations with some ASEAN countries, it might risk worsening ties with others. So let's just look a bit at this little visual I've made, which is based on a 2016 GIS-based study. Now, what the study did was basically map out the global shipping routes based on GIS calculations, and then calculated the reduction in these global shipping routes lengths if the canal were to be built. And as you can see, there's some very clear winners and very clear losers. So let me just quickly take you through each of them. Let's start with Thailand. Quite obviously, building a canal would be great for Thailand. Let's look at Vietnam, for example. So if this entire shipping route has increased traffic, it's great for Vietnamese exporters, it's great for Vietnamese transshipment facilities. It's quite obviously great for China, as we saw. But it's also great for Laos and Cambodia. Now, Laos is landlocked. It has no access to the sea. It depends on its neighbors for shipping facilities. If building the canal would lead to these neighbors building more facilities to capitalize on them, it's great for Laos. And the same applies for Cambodia as well, though Cambodia isn't really great in the shipping trade right now. Rerouting global traffic from Malacca through the canal into Bangkok would be great for Cambodia and give them an opportunity to develop. With that said, it's obviously not great for Malaysia because Malaysia depends on traffic going through the Malacca Straits. It's not that good for Singapore because Singapore is also a global transshipment hub. Though Singapore, there's often there's this assumption that building the canal would basically wipe out Singapore from the map. That's not necessarily the case because, as I said, they have the institutional ability, they have way better transshipment facilities, and it will take quite a while for Kragh to really mount a noticeable threat to their command of the global shipping trade. Finally, you have Indonesia. Indonesia is also somewhat affected. But the key takeaway from all this is that the effects of the Kra Canal are not unilaterally great for every ASEAN country. Building the canal would noticeably improve China's relationship with some of them, but also worsen it with a lot more of them. I'm sure you noticed also in the previous slide that India was highlighted green. And the reason for that is because a considerable amount of India's trade also goes through the Malacca Straits. You can see here that there's positive and negative effects for India. First of all is that increased trade volumes are obviously great for India. Second, divisions in ASEAN with Malaysia and Singapore having worsened relationships with China is potentially an opportunity for Indian diplomacy. But on the negative side, an expanded Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region and in Southeast Asia is not necessarily in India's interests. And having countries in ASEAN that are beholden to China for their economic development is not great for us either. So given what I've said so far, given the complexity and the interplay of the possible benefits and costs of the canal, it doesn't seem like it's going to materialize anytime soon. But the reason why I've made this presentation come all the way to Delhi to tell you guys this is because it provides an interesting opportunity for India to think about how to manage China's influence in the Indian Ocean region. So I'd like to propose a principle which I think you'll see in our research as well and also in Manoj's presentation, which is that when in our relationship with China, India needs to do all it can to maximize the potential benefits of engaging while managing the risks of doing so. Let me give you an example. So look at this map of global shipping traffic averaged out over a year. This is the Bay of Bengal, and I'm sure that you think that, hey, this is pretty good, right? I mean, there's plenty of ships clearly going through this region. It means that India has got a lot of economic interests. It's wonderful, but this is how it compares to global shipping. The Bay of Bengal is minuscule compared to the amount of traffic that's passing through these other choke points, and that's actually going alongside Sri Lanka and into the Straits of Malacca. So what does India need to do? This brings me back to the first 3 recommendations that I made. First, develop transshipment facilities, and whether or not the Kra Canal is built, it is absolutely in India's interest to make it easier for shipping to move along our eastern coast. It's also very important for us to make it easier for Indian manufacturers to export stuff from along the east coast, which means you have to not only build transshipment facilities, but also integrate it with Indian logistics networks. Second, India doesn't necessarily end at the east coast, right? It doesn't end at Visakhapatnam or at Kanyakumari. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are also part of India. And it's very important to realize that the Andaman Islands give us a perfect strategic vantage point, not over only a potential Kra Canal, but also over the Malacca Straits. It's absolutely critical for India to build surveillance and sea denial capabilities there so that we have control over this very crucial global choke point. Third, if the Chinese were to go ahead with building the Kra Canal, they would not do it unilaterally because, as I said, it would potentially feed into the debt trap narrative. So if they were to build it, they'd probably do it in conjunction with a bunch of AIIB partners and so on and so forth. And if they were to do that, I suggest that we take a lesson from China's playbook and suggest a technical hold on any initiatives they might have in terms of building the canal. So let me just take you over the 3 key ideas of my presentation, add one to that actually. First, the canal is not going to materialize immediately because of all the challenges involved. Second, it's not aimed at India. It might impact our interests, but we need to think about how we can maximize those interests. Third, if we want to benefit from Kragh, and even if Kragh isn't built, we need to take action yesterday. And finally, not just in the Indian Ocean region, but also in our relationship with China generally, we need to do all we can to maximize the benefits of engaging while managing the risks of doing so. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anirudh. I think we should have a one-pun cap on all PowerPoints. But thank you for that very interesting and informative PowerPoint, which I hope to discuss with you. But before we go any further, I want to call Manoj Kewalramani to speak about 5G, Huawei, and geopolitics. What is the Indian roadmap here?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ambassador Raghavan and Nitin. Thank you, Suhasini. Thanks, Anirudh. You set this up wonderfully. Okay, so I'm going to do something similar to what Anirudh did, where, but I wouldn't call it a reverse Bollywood format. Staying in tune with the theme of the presentation, I'm going to give you a backdoor into my conclusions. Okay. So should India permit Huawei, and Huawei here as a representative of Chinese telecom firms, role in the country's 5G networks? So there is obviously an economic rationale to do this, right? I mean, they offer you cheap and high quality equipment. They're cash rich, so they can really support our telecom development. But there are security and strategic implications that need to be considered in making this decision. Therefore, our recommendations are that the Cabinet Committee on Security, which is the highest level decision-making body on matters of national security, should be leading the decision-making in this. This should not be left to just the Telecom Ministry or Commerce and Finance. This is a much broader issue. Government of India should publish a whitelist of trusted entities. This is partners, governments and vendors in the telecom and cybersecurity domains. This will be useful for multiple purposes, which I'll go into later. And finally, the most important one, particularly in this context of Huawei and China, there shouldn't be an outright ban on any vendor. But Chinese vendors should be treated specially. Their participation should be restricted and tightly regulated. There have to be certain conditions that have to be placed, and I'll get into why I argue for these. But before I get into why I argue for this, let me tell you how I arrived at these conclusions. So what we first did was we looked at certain factors. We looked at the state of the Indian telecom sector. We looked at the nature of 5G technology in itself, because as Ambassador Raghavan mentioned, it is important to understand the domain before you can actually comment about how policy needs to be shaped. We looked at Huawei in itself, all the controversies and everything together. And we looked at this emerging dynamic between the US and China, well, led by the US and China, but also other countries, because Europe's a partner in this, Russia is a partner in this, and the geopolitics of technology, which at the moment are playing out in the 5G domain. So we looked at all of this, and we looked at India's interests. So what are our interests? Our interests are that we need cost-effective, cutting-edge and reliable technology to aid our growth. We need to ensure network security while we do all of that. But amid all of this also, we need to ensure that what is emerging, and I don't like this term, but this is probably the most convenient term to describe what's happening in the world, given that it's very complicated what's happening. But there is somewhat of an technology chill, there is a technology cold war, there is a certain divide that's developing. And in this, we'll have to make hard choices. And in order to make those hard choices, we need to ensure that we have a certain degree of autonomy and we don't get locked into certain systems. So that's broadly our interests. And that's how we mapped the study. So to begin with, I'm going to look at the Indian telecom sector. Very briefly, it's dominated by three players that you can see over there. There's been lots of churn in the sector over the last few years after Jio entered. And the focus of each of these major players has been that we need to expand market share, capacity, and quality and coverage. And if we can do that, we can eventually monetize. Right now, the race is to not to seek profits per se, but to actually capture the market and improve quality. The time to seek profits will come, and that will not be necessarily great for consumers. So at the moment, therefore, what these telecom operators are suffering through are very low average revenues per user. Monthly, these range from anywhere between 88-90 rupees to about 130, which is really, really low. Some of them are hoping for 5G to take this up to 300, given the nature of use cases of 5G. And therefore, there's high levels of debt because you're investing very heavily. Again, debt levels for any of these range from anywhere between 8 to 9%, the debt to earnings ratio anywhere between 8 to 9% to even 25%. So it's extremely difficult for them to continue making heavy investments. Another curious factor within the Indian technology telecom sector domain is that we have a very heavy reliance on imported equipment. Our import bill last year was around $21 billion. Over 90% of the equipment was imported. And amid all of this, amid this sort of, and there is an effort to indigenize import. There's a plan which has been proposed to launch a fund which can support indigenization of telecom equipment. But as for the purposes of our study, we saw that as unviable to do that at the scale that is needed in the near term. Because 5G, and that's needed to be done, we need to have more investment because 5G represents new opportunities, it presents new revenue streams, but in order to do that, you need capital investment. So that's broadly the state of our telecom sector. I'm now going to go into a little bit about the technology, what are the kind of opportunities and threats that 5G presents. So this is a map that was done by James Lewis for CSIS, where he explains how this technology is supposed to operate. Unlike 4G and 5G, the core is going to be separated at a distance. And therefore you can use this core network separately and you can firewall it in some ways. But broadly this is how it operates, right? There's an edge service, which is where you have got your mobile phones, your autonomous vehicles, your devices, your robots, and so on and so forth. Those connect to your RAN systems, and your RAN systems essentially clean up everything, clean up your signals and everything, and eventually they send them to the core. And at the core is where all your data, voice, and internet is processed, and you have authorizations. So that's the heart of the network. So that's briefly how this operates. And you can see in this graph itself that which are the kind of companies which are dominating different segments in the system. So the nature of 5G essentially is that it's going to provide us very high speeds. It's going to provide us with very high connection density and near zero latency. The speeds estimated for 5G in comparison to 4G are 100 plus times more. Connection density far, far significant. Under 4G, we have a connection density of about 2,000 devices per square kilometer. Under 5G, we're anticipating this to go up to 2.6 million devices per square kilometer. And in terms of latency, that refers to the speed at which the system responds to your request. And in 5G, the response would be very, very quick, nearly real time. And that's needed if you want to develop autonomous vehicles, because you need your vehicles to respond in real time and not buffer while you drive. So therefore, what all this is going to do is it's going to enhance machine-to-machine connectivity, improve data analytics, and also improve automation. And that's going to open up a new stream of businesses, new products will come into being. It's also going to enhance governance capacity, how we manage transport, how we manage energy. All of that's going to change. And you can see some of this already happening, right, with particularly in countries like, say, China. You can see more technology being used, more facial recognition being used. You can see pilot zones for autonomous vehicle testing. And that's happening around the world. And it'll happen in India, too. An estimate by a government study done in August last year was that 5G by 2035 would add about 1 trillion to the Indian GDP. Globally, that's estimated to be at about 12.5 trillion. So there's a lot of money to be made here. But amidst all this, there are some massive risks that are going to come this way, because it's not just going to bring all of this, it's also going to bring in new vulnerabilities. And this chart sort of tells you a little bit about these vulnerabilities. Now, this is what I would call operational risks that we need to take care of. Okay, so this is about how secure is your network, how much can it process data, how much can it manage the traffic that's coming its way, how vulnerable it is to breakdowns and also to mischief, to espionage, and to disruptions by a foreign actor, depending on who's providing the equipment and how it's managed. But this gives you a sense of what are the kind of risks. And think of it in the context of the use cases. So if your use cases are transportation and managing your entire transportation system in a city, and if that gets disrupted, the kind of disruption that can be caused compared to your internet going off right now and you can't access YouTube or Netflix. There's a qualitative difference in that. Okay, so what's the controversy around Huawei? I mentioned that it depends. Your risk is also dependent on the service provider and the net and the people who are providing your equipment. So with regard to Huawei, that's primarily the concern. But it's a broader issue, right? There's a from an Indian point of view, there are pros and cons of having Huawei in. Firstly, the company has operated in India for the last 20 years. It has a base in India. It understands the market. Its revenues in India last year was estimated at about $1.5 billion, which is not too much given that its overall revenue was $108 billion. But given that that's going to be falling in the coming year by about $20 to $30 billion, according to Ranjang Fei, India becomes an even more important market, not just for existing revenues, but also for potential revenues going forward. Huawei will provide us cost-effective and high-quality products. It is a patent leader in the 5G domain. It is, in fact, the patent leader in the 5G domain. It's one of 4 Chinese companies in the top 11 in terms of owning standard essential patents in the 5G domain. So it does have quality. It spends immensely on R&D, and I'll just show you a chart here which tells you how much it spends on R&D. You can see that it's outstripping all of its competitors by a mile. And this is R&D across the board, not just 5G, but even in 5G, it outstrips its competitors by a mile. And it wants to spend more money because it has access to more money, courtesy of the Chinese government. I'm going to go back to my slide. Okay, yeah. So it has patent leadership, and therefore it is cash rich because it wants to spend more money. And given the fact that our telecom sector is struggling with regard to cash, this might be a good partner. It will be willing to spend. The cons, however, and the primary con here is the linkage that Huawei has with the Chinese party state. And that's deeply problematic because Huawei was founded by Ranjang Fei, who was a former PLA engineer. He started the company in 1987. And since then, the ties between the parties and the Chinese state and Huawei have been slightly murky. The company has not necessarily been very transparent about its governance structure. It's not been very transparent about its reporting, annual reports. Imagine Huawei started working in India in 1998, 99, but the first time it publicly published annual reports was in 2011, 2012, and that was also because the US House of Representatives was investigating Huawei. And so as a preemptive strike, they put out an annual report, which gave you some murky information about its governance structure. But the primary issue is that there's a deep linkage with the party. Huawei is supported by the party in terms of BRI right now, but even before that, a lot of the Chinese state funding goes into companies, ostensibly private companies, in order to support R&D work. the Chinese banking system is state-owned, and the banks provide a lot of funding to companies. Particularly Huawei has been the recipient of millions and millions of dollars. Just in 2016, 2017, it was estimated that they've received about 190 to 200 million dollars in grants, and that you separate that from projects that Huawei gets as China goes out and undertakes Belt and Road Initiative projects. So in Africa, it's building a telecommunications infrastructure under the Belt and Road, and it's taking loans from the Chinese banking system. So there is a deep linkage between the party state and Huawei, and that's problematic. And why is that problematic is because not just normally in the normal course of events, but in the last few years, there have been legislative changes in China. The national security law came in, which essentially demands that even ostensibly private companies be subservient to state security interests. So the threat, therefore, is that Huawei can potentially, even though it may be a private company, it can potentially put aside its corporate interests in order to serve the Chinese state's interests. And if it's therefore active in a market like India, where there are specific issues with China, that might not be a good position for us to be in. So that's predominantly the American view also. The American view is that the PRC essentially is a revisionist competitor of America. That's what the national security strategy released under Donald Trump says. It highlights the party state's linkages with big tech companies, and it's going across the board from an American point of view. It talks about the potential of Huawei and Chinese telecommunications companies to compromise communication systems and national security systems, not just in the US, but also in partner countries. And that therefore compromises the US's ability to work with these partner countries. And therefore you've had Mike Pompeo go around and Mike Pence threaten other countries saying that, well, we might have to end all sorts of cooperation with you guys if you guys have Chinese telecom companies and their equipment in your systems. But the problem with that argument that the US is making is that the US has tended to be unpredictable in the last few years, particularly under Donald Trump. Trump has been threatening to ban Huawei for over a year. He only did it in May this year, and that too after the 11th round of trade talks with China failed. There was no inkling that he would go ahead and do this, given that he tried to ban ZTE last year. But immediately after the ban, he reversed it. But this time around, they've taken a harsh stand on Huawei. They've put Huawei and 68 of its affiliates on an entity list, which limits its ability to work with other partners. But soon after doing that, within a couple of weeks, there was a reversal of that. Well, not reversal, but there was a step back where you gave a 90-day reprieve so that you could negotiate this broader trade deal with China. And in that context, one would wonder whether the US would be in a position where it wants to bargain Huawei away as part of a broader trade deal. And if it ends up doing that, then where does it leave the other guys who took the US's lead and decided to ban Huawei? How does it leave their relationship with China? And Canada is a perfect example of this, which has arrested the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, and today finds itself in a difficult position where they've publicly said that we are struggling to get cooperation from the US in dealing with China, because the Chinese have hit back with using economic leverage that they have, particularly on canola oil and meat and so on and so forth. However, the Chinese responded to this. Well, the Chinese have said, look, this is not about rule of law. This is not about espionage. This is about none of that. This is simply the US being protectionist. And it's politicizing an issue which does not need to be politicized. This is a business issue. And the reason that it's doing this is because it's anxious about losing its lead in the world. This is a power play. This is a power play to limit China's growing rise and influence, which, according to the Chinese, has been peaceful. That's been coupled with a PR campaign by Huawei. Just yesterday, there was an op-ed in the New York Times, which was paid for by Huawei, and which was essentially saying why Australia should reverse its decision to ban Huawei. So imagine a PR campaign which places op-eds in the New York Times paid for by Huawei. But Rang Zhengfei, who's so far been very reclusive, has come out publicly and spoken multiple times to even American news networks, talking about how they would not spy even if asked to by the Chinese government. And just a couple of days ago, we heard that Huawei's the point man for Huawei in India was offering a no backdoor pact to India, which is strange, given that why would you offer one if there didn't exist any? But yeah. That's been part of Huawei's efforts. The Chinese have also offered diplomatic carrots and sticks. Last year, Huawei promised India over 100 million in investments in telecom. Even Jay Chen's interview a couple of days ago says that, well, a lot of Chinese investors, tech investors, are looking at India's decision on Huawei to decide whether they can enter the market or not. So there's a bit of stick and carrot going on over there. And the last thing that the Chinese have done is that they've said, look, everybody spies. Prism on the wall was the term that was used during the Barcelona Mobile World Congress in February by Huawei representatives. They've reminded you that, look, the Americans do this better than us, and we're not really there to do it because we're offering you all these packs. So that's broadly been the Chinese response. And they've backed on the fact that they have diplomatic, political, and financial capital to be able to push Huawei in some spaces. And they've managed to do that. And that leads us to this kind of a map where the countries in red are the countries where Huawei and Chinese telecom operators already have struck deals. The countries in orange and blue are the countries that are still sort of working out what they need to do. And the countries in black are the guys who said no Huawei. And not entirely completely. So in the case of Japan, it's only in terms of government procurement. In the case of New Zealand, they've dilly-dallied. Australia was the leader in this actually, even before the US, the Australians banned it. And the US, well, they've banned government procurement. They've also banned Huawei's operations in the country. But perhaps Huawei's role in the US is very limited. It's in rural areas. But perhaps if it's part of a broader trade deal, there might be the formal sort of restrictions might go away. But that's what it's leading us to, a divided world. So in this scenario, what does India do? Well, the first thing is very, very clear. There is an economic logic to permitting Huawei in India's 5G ecosystem. I've spoken about the cash, I've spoken about the technology, I've spoken about the cost effectiveness. It works. There's also a case to be made that deeper India-China technology cooperation, which the Chinese are very keen for, and so are we, could help build constituencies desiring stability in this relationship. This relationship for the longest time has been dominated by the high politics and the tensions between Beijing and Delhi. And perhaps building deeper business linkages which are forward-looking could help stabilize this, or at least could play some sort of a role and create one constituency. But while saying all of that, there are clearly operational level threats. But these threats are not necessarily limited only to Chinese vendors, right? Ericsson, Nokia, whoever. Everybody can have backdoors. Everybody does have backdoors. Everybody can read your emails. It's just about who should be reading your emails that you should be worried about. And that's why the threats regarding Chinese vendors are amplified. And that's owing to the nature of 5G, Huawei's linkage with the party state, and also the broader issues within the Sino-Indian relationship. I don't think we can decouple that. Europe's relationship with China is very different from India's relationship with China. We have a long, historically contested border, which is still unresolved. We also have multiple other issues in terms of broader influence in Asia. And therefore, I don't think we can look at China the same way as Europe does. Yet, we need to look at the state of the Indian economy and where we can leverage Chinese development. Lastly, the splintering of the global cyberspace and the decoupling of the technology and innovation ecosystems, which is basically happening, which was represented in that map that I showed you, this poses a challenge to India's strategic autonomy in terms of decisions on technology. And that's particularly given the fact that our technological base and our innovation base is not where it should be to be a serious competitor right now in this particular race. And therefore, we need to engage in partnerships. But the decisions that we make here can potentially compromise the partnerships that we can engage in. And therefore, it's a tricky decision to make. I think my last slide is stuck. Okay, so therefore, what do we recommend? We recommend that the Cabinet Committee on Security takes a lead in decision making on this matter, but not just this matter, on matters related to new technologies, even artificial intelligence and whom should India partner with, what should India be doing in that context. The CCS should be taking the lead. It should be guiding policy making on partner selection. It should be guiding policy making on cyber audits, cyber security, and these things need to be taken far more seriously, and capacity needs to be built in this area. The government of India should publish a white list. This operates at multiple levels, right? The Chinese want to publish an unreliable entities list. The US has a entity list, which is essentially a blacklist. We should look at a white list. And what a white list does is that it creates an aspirational signal. Firstly, it tells your telecom operators whom they can work with. It gives a signal to them that these are guys who are good to work with. Secondly, it signals an aspirational standard for potential partners to aspire to reach. And if they can reach those, great, they become part of the whitelist. And thirdly, it also creates this perception amongst partners, international partners who have similar threat perceptions, particularly in the domain of cybersecurity, to work with us on those threat perceptions. Potentially, that could lead to transfer of technical know-how and technology itself. Thirdly, India's 5G network infrastructure must not be reliant on any one vendor. There are significant economic and political costs. If you lock into one vendor right now, let's just put the political costs aside. If you lock into any vendor right now, switching from that as things go bad is going to be extremely expensive and very, very difficult to do. So therefore, we need not be and we should not be reliant on any one vendor. There shouldn't be an outright ban on Chinese vendors, but their participation must be restricted, conditional, and tightly regulated. The whitelist takes care of some of this, but also predominantly I described the core and the edge systems. It's great to have Chinese vendors in our edge systems. They provide you with low-cost, high-quality equipment. Let's use them. But in the core, no, I would want to keep them out because that's where the mischief can happen. And that's where I want to keep them out. Or at least that's where the mischief at scale can happen. And that's where we'd better keep them out. So from core and critical sectors, we'd like to exclude Chinese vendors. But from the edge sectors, absolutely. Cheaper phones, greater connectivity for Indians, more Indians getting online, more Indians using technology. Great for us, improves our economic growth, improves the social development also in the country. And lastly, the size of the Indian market. And this is the primary principle that underpins everything. It is important to start looking at the size of the Indian market as a key source of strategic leverage. Economics is not just about economics, it is geoeconomics, it is associated with geostrategy, and we need to think about the policies that we make domestically for our domestic markets and the impact that they will have in terms of our strategic options globally. And therefore, we need to start using the Indian market and the size of it and the potential of it as a source of leverage to achieve geopolitical and strategic objectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. May I sort of just invite Jabin and Anirudh to come closer so we can get into this discussion straight away. I'm sure some of you, at least as I did, were wondering what the two had to do with each other. These are two disparate subjects that we are going to talk about, and you're going to hear some, you're going to get into them in depth after lunch. So I won't get into the basics. I'm going to try and get a sense of geopolitics, where India is, where India's neighborhood is, with the ideas of what are some of the common threads that do bring these two issues together, the Kra Canal on one side, and the 5G and Huawei question on the other. Do things like trade, transshipment, telecommunications, in some abstract way actually refer to flows that we have to decide how we want to take forward? The first question is really, I think, in terms of the obvious choice that we are more and more being forced into because the world is becoming like that. It's no longer a question of just saying we are victims of all the fault lines that exist in the world. The real choice is an internal one. It's a choice between national security and development needs. Whether we're talking about the Kra Canal, whether we're talking about 5G, that's basically what that question is, and it's internal to every country. Every country is now looking at it from their point of view. The second, of course, when it comes to India, is about India's sphere of influence. We used to speak about a zone of peace, we no longer do. We used to speak about the idea of spheres of influence, where countries essentially didn't come into what we would call perhaps the airspace of other countries. You know, so you would leave countries to their neighborhoods, or powers, regional powers, sub-regional powers to their neighborhoods. But now India's sphere of influence doesn't seem to have the same, if you like, resilience or defense systems. It is vulnerable. The third question in both these cases is about countering China's rise. Can China just basically spread its arms out wherever it likes and pick up what it wants to in terms of markets, in terms of labor, in terms of selling its technology and procuring energy without being challenged? And the fourth is really what I think you referred to, or I'm not sure, one of you referred to as the idea of the technological Cold War, but actually the new Cold War. It's clear that the divisions between the US on one side and the Russia-China combined on the other are presenting to us choices on a daily basis, and those are choices that do begin to resemble a little bit of what was happening during the Cold War. Now, they don't just come out of the rivalry between US and China and US and Russia. They come out of three separate phenomena that we have seen. One being the fact that we now have a closer relationship between Moscow and Beijing than we've had at any point in history since the 1950s. It's cemented, of course, by the Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin personal bond, but then there is this huge energy line that goes between them. There's investment. There's the fact that they have each other's back. You know, it's not just about issue-based alignments as we talk about it. For them, there is a very, very seamless alignment on many issues. And while India would have preferred to have seen a little bit of air between the two of them, it has been made even more difficult by the second phenomenon, which is the US actually calling out Russia and China as its central challenges. That's what it did in the 2018 National Defense Strategy Doctrine that it puts out every few years. And the US has made it very clear that they see Russia and China as revisionist powers. What is that? What impact has that had? It's had an impact of bringing them even closer together. And I think the third phenomenon has been of India looking outside of its, traditional, some call extinct, ideas of non-alignment. What is the new version, or where has India moved from non-alignment? Some would say it has moved to an era of multi-alignment. Some would say it's moved to an era of issue-based alignment. But while it sounds very clever, the fact is, are issue-based alignments on offer in a world that I've just described? Are people saying, yeah, you can take a little bit of Huawei for this technology, for your infrastructure, but when it comes to procurement of handsets, you got to take something else. If it comes to your core situation, you can take something else. So are those offers out there when it comes to trade, technology, telecommunications, energy supplies, and all the rest of that? Are people saying to you, yeah, you're sure you can decide where you want to stand when it comes to data localization, you can stand where you want to when it comes to digital economies? I don't think so. I think increasingly people are speaking about the buffet options or the set menu options rather than a la carte options. So when the US says don't buy the S400, they're not just saying that's because we have a sanctions law against you. The US is saying if you buy the S400, you are going to forego an entire platform of technology and military hardware that we would otherwise consider supplying to you, which includes aeroplanes and everything else. It has nothing, it isn't just about the missile systems. So those are the themes that really bring our two presentations together. And I want to bring in Jabin at this point and ask you, Jabin, when we are looking at this area of contestation, do you think India is prevailing or floundering over the narratives when it comes to energy supplies on one side, essentially energy, but also trade supplies, trade routes, and telecommunication?
All right. Thank you, Suhasini, and thank you to Takshashila Institution for this opportunity to speak to you guys. I think one connecting point certainly is China, and because I work on China, I guess that's why I'm here. Let me start off by quickly answering your question, Suhasini, which is, frankly, in terms of narrative, India does the floundering part pretty well. And if you look at the PR exercise, Manoj just talked about the Huawei's PR exercise. Huawei, a private company, has an excellent PR exercise, and which is something that even the government of India actually can learn a great deal from. So in terms of how we manage the perception game, I think India has a long, long way to go, certainly. But having said that, I'd like to sort of draw 3 or 4 different strands together in this entire exercise, and I think I have about 10 minutes. So I'll try and do it quickly. One is I'd like you to please note, underline the role of the Communist Party of China. I mean, when we talk about China, we sort of all too often talk about China as some sort of a monolith. But, the fact that China does what it does, the fact that as, Manoj raised a question about the private sector in China. I mean, what is the private sector in China? It's essentially, there is no such thing as a private sector in China when the Communist Party of China is what, is the one ring that rules over them all. If you're Lord of the Rings fans, So, the Communist Party of China, simply because it has a survival issue at stake, has this big picture approach to China's foreign policy. It has turned several complaints it has had about the global system, the global order, into strategic opportunities, into strategic outreach. And I would just refer you to the question of the point about how India made this excellent case in 2017 about why it was not attending the Belt and Road Forum in May 2017. It had an excellent, short statement that said all these points about lack of accountability, lack of feasibility, and so on and so forth, lack of transparency. But if you ask what has India done since then to sort of match the words with actions to sort of challenge China on that front, I leave it to you. I mean, my judgment is that very little has been done. Of course, 2 years is too short a time, but it gets you thinking. Now, let me also return to the question of the private sector, and I say don't believe a word of Ren Chongfei when he says that he will sort of somehow not listen to the Chinese government. I mean, if he doesn't listen to the Chinese government, he goes into prison. His daughter is in prison in Canada. That's a very safe prison there, a very comfortable existence there. If he goes to prison in China, you will not hear of him. All right. So, as you've not heard of the two Canadians who've been imprisoned because his daughter has been imprisoned in Canada. And look at the way the MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, is supporting Huawei in its entire PR campaign. It's part of the PR campaign. But number three, you also have to understand matters from the Chinese perspective. Okay, and I guess that's one reason why I'm here, that, to try and sort of put you guys in China's shoes and see how the Chinese think about it. When they think about it, it is quite right. Manoj raised some of those points that, they look as if, they feel as if they are being picked on by the Americans because, PRISM, I mean, you guys are fine with the Americans reading your data and your emails, and somehow it's okay, it's not okay that the Chinese read their emails. I mean, if Anirudh does the kind of punning that he does in emails, I mean, the Chinese are not going to figure out his emails, right? So I think maybe it's not such a bad thing that the Chinese get to, because they're not going to make sense of these emails, right? So do not forget that companies like Cisco, which is an American company that provides routers, has any number of backdoors too, and probably get caught more often than Huawei does. So, things are not so black and white, and I think a point that both of them underline in their presentations, and at least in the written documents, is that, there is no solution to this from India's perspective unless we indigenize, all right? And unless we sort of are able to stand on our own 2 feet on all of these issues, whether it's building canals, whether it's dredging, whether it's reclaiming islands, whether it is hardware for IoT or software, there is no end of dependence. And one thing I'd like to point out about this study on the Kra Canal is, while Anirudh might have concluded that, look, it's not happening, it's also important to do the study to tell you that it's not happening, because it's important not to lose your heads over every single thing the Chinese do, all right? I mean, they are not 10 feet tall, they make a lot of mistakes, and we have to deal with it accordingly. If we start sort of spreading our resources because China is doing this there, China is doing that there, then, we are only going to be in a reactive position rather than in a position to take sort of initiative. Very briefly on the sort of implications that, the Kra Canal study did for India. I didn't see a statement saying that the Kra Canal also works security-wise for us, for the Indian Navy. If it's easy for the Chinese to access the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean, it's also easier for us to access the South China Sea. That's okay. It doesn't happen if the Chinese control the Kra Canal. But supposing India and Japan, or better still, if India alone were to build a Kra Canal, why not? Wouldn't that work for us? Look at the advantages of that, maybe. Capacity is another issue, but at least are we dreaming about it? That's one thing. Second, I mean, you use the expression sea denial. That's a bit of a red line for the Chinese, so we got to think about how we work around that. Let me come to the recommendations in the Huawei study. I think the whitelist is an excellent idea, but this point that, and I refer again to what Suhasini was saying, that if you say that the Chinese can do one end of the spectrum of offering the edge services, and the other companies can do the middle or the higher end, but then you also raise your costs, because then you leave very little room for bargaining in that middle service, the core technologies, which you are again handing over to the Ericssons and the Nokias or the Ciscos. Yeah. So I think that speaks to the point that Suhasini was making about the issue-based alignments being on offer. They simply are not on offer there. And in your paper, you talk about this mix of regulation and technological solutions. What I'd really like to know is what exactly is the mix? I mean, that's $1 million question. Yeah. And again, while the point was made about how the Russians and the Chinese are pretty comfortable with each other, I can't imagine the Russians are comfortable with Huawei in their territory. I mean, Russia is also a technological power. Yeah. They are also engaged in denial of services attacks, and so they've got the capacity. So how is it that Russia is comfortable with Huawei? What is it about that Russian experience that we might learn something from? All right. I think, especially from the technology side, that might be something that we might sort of pay attention to. The other thing is, when you say no over-reliance, and that we should sort of source our equipment from multiple vendors, but you also hear this argument made about the Indian Air Force sourcing its jets from multiple countries, and how that has a cost implication. So if that is a problem, when Indian Air Force has jets from the US, or not yet from the US, but other aircraft from the US, from France, from Russia, and that is a problem of spares, of interface, why would this be easy for, from in the telecom sector? Maybe there's a volume argument to be made. The other thing is, even 4G has not been fully rolled out and implemented in India. Yes. You will, of course, all of you will find that your mobile phone doesn't work when you go to your grandparents' village or to Arunachal. I mean, if you go to Arunachal, you stand on the LAC, you will actually connect to China mobile because your Airtel stops working. All right. So, and the cost of spectrum. I mean, the government doesn't seem to have a policy yet on how it's going to auction the spectrum. So, what are the cost implications there? Plus this very interesting point you made about how Vodafone was using 2G and 3G with what you call dynamic spectrum refining. So, do we really need 5G everywhere? Does that bring down the incentives for Huawei or anybody else to sort of invest the way we? So that's sort of that sort of aspect needs to be looked at. Finally, let me end with this statement from the U.S. National Security Strategy, which calls China a revisionist power and a competitor that gathers and exploits data on an unrivaled scale, etc., etc., etc. Now, the question for us is there a situation when that's okay? That data maybe is not necessary. I mean, it's a sort of a counterintuitive question. Why is data so important if we do not have the capacity to use the data? Which leads me to the next question. This Reliance Jio, Vodafone, Airtel, you mentioned that the number of players in the Indian telecom market has come down. Yeah. It's time for the Indian government to ask this question, whether allowing Reliance, this sort of Reliance especially, this sort of market monopoly without something in return, where Reliance companies like these only exploit the Indian market. They are not interested in exploiting the global market. So whereas companies like ZTE, Huawei are enjoined by the Chinese government, the Communist Party, to also be global champions, not just national champions. So we give you a monopoly in China, but you're also expected to be global players, to raise China's profile outside. But if our companies are not doing the same, why give them the sort of free play that we do? All right? I mean, what is Reliance's R&D spend? That's a question that maybe all of you need to ask. What is the R&D spend of our companies in India? So are they actually, even after we create all this level playing field for them, are they actually going to use that to step into the global markets, to become global players? And you know, having as somebody who studies China, I see this constant stress on global ambitions for even the smallest Chinese company. Even a provincial state-owned enterprise in China wants to go global, wants to be players. I mean, if you look at how the Chinese have taken over several mobile phone apps in Southeast Asia, or the news media in Africa, I mean, where is India in all of this? I mean, if I ask the Hindu, does the Hindu have a international edition? Does the Hindu seek to be an international player? Or does any of our multiple news channels want to be international players? How many foreigners actually listen to NDTV or Times Now? I mean, surely everybody loves a slanging match on TV, but nobody seems to. I mean, these are not global players. So I think if we do not have global ambitions, if we do not have the spend, I mean, simple thing. Fine, we have all of this 5G, but is all of this 5G going to be used to make mobile phones or laptops available to government school children to learn coding? So, I mean, this non-latency business, what is the non-latency for if we are not going to be in a position to exploit it? So I think I will leave these larger questions as also something that we need to ponder about and hopefully act quickly on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabin. And I think two more things that I think maybe you did mention, but do bind the two of you together, is one is that you've made the case that we do not know enough about either of these two issues in time. You know, you might say that the Kra Canal is happening, but you're essentially saying that it could. And if it does, India has to be already far ahead in terms of, denying what you call sea denial and all the rest of it, and infrastructure in the Andamans. And the second thing was, I have to say, a certain inevitability in your final slides that kind of more or less said, okay, so, but we are going to have to deal with Huawei, and we are going to have to find ways of benefiting from a Kra Canal outlook in the future, but not that we can actually stop it. I'm going to stop over here and just ask how many questions there are in the audience, and then we can go forward. We seem to have a lot. I know Ambassador Smriti will want to speak about Huawei, so should we start with you and get that out of the way? And
high quality, and this is the first good discussion on 5G that I've attended. So thank you very much to the organizers for this. But I just want to point out a couple of deficiencies in my view. One is that you should perhaps, when you have a slide on Indian telecom operators, have a slide also on Indian telecom manufacturers. And we have excellent technology in India, but the government extends zero support to it. Not only zero support, our tenders are mostly fixed, and I've got a list of them, in which foreign companies are winning them because of, various under the table considerations. So we haven't at all supported our companies. We have 6G know-how in this country, and our think tanks don't talk about it. So we need to really bridge that gap and bring these companies into the discussion, because you're talking about technology, geopolitics. These two things are very highly interrelated, as China has proven. So that's the first thing. And I would also say that DOT is treating telecom not as a strategic sector, but as a milch cow. It is not looking at it, in terms of, as you said, promotion of Indian technological capabilities abroad or any such thing. And it extends zero support to Indian manufacturers. So that is a tremendous issue that I think think tanks should be taking up. And I'm hoping to talk to Ambassador Raghavan about this issue and taking this forward. The second issue, of course, is the issue of the vulnerability to Chinese equipment being inducted. And that is the fact that even with 4G, the Chinese sitting in China can remotely switch off your networks and bring India to a grinding halt. So again, that issue should be looked at. Third issue, which I'm sure Professor Goel will take up, is the issue of whether we need 5G at all, whether any such study has been done apart from the point of view of the equipment providers. And finally, health effects. We hear that birds are being fried on there because of the very high frequency, and the technology is so dense. So I think a lot of these issues should be taken up in further discussions, and I again commend you for a brilliant discussion.
Thank you. I saw a lot of questions in the back. If you don't mind, sir, we'll start with some of. Why don't you go ahead, ma'am, and then we'll. You need to wait for the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Surabhi. I'm a research fellow at the council. Well, I have a number of questions on the 5G.
Just one.
Yeah, but I'll restrict myself to just one.
Because the 5G is a separate session
Yes.
you can deal with.
When you speak about core and edge, I don't think that the world in itself is clear about how to control traffic at core and edge, because when Britain spoke about allowing Huawei at the edge networks, their defense secretary had to be removed. And when you talk about Huawei and 5G technology in itself, Huawei is also going to lay optical cables, and that will change how data is transmitted across the world. So your take on that?
Yeah.
All right.
Should I answer? Do you want?
Why don't we take a few?
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir. In front here.
Hello. So when Takshashila runs on 3G and the first G is generation, the two presentation doesn't, and the generation composed of people or individuals, and the two presentation only put the estate perspective on Kra Canal and this 5G. So why not the people's perspective? So my question would be that, what about the security and privacy right of the people? And the second would be that, how is the Kra Canal or 5G going to impact the natural environment when we are living at the catastrophic aspect, phase of climate change? And the third question would be that, change the country, like put the India in the shoes of China or put the America in the shoes of China. Then what would be our anxiety, what we are dealing now? Like I am a Bangladeshi, so I have no issue with China, no issue with America, no issue with China. Like if the Huawei was an Indian company, if the Huawei was a Norwegian company, so what would be our anxiety then?
Sure. As that famous Trevor Noah show sort of said, that the only reason America wants you not to take Huawei or slow down on taking Huawei is they want to catch up and have access to the same thing. There was a few hands up at the back. I'll just take two more and then.
Hello, I'm Rajesh. I would like to ask Mr. Anirudh that what is the status of the Sabang port in Indonesia? Like India wanted to collaborate for defense purposes, and I hope if that comes through, then we will have extra leverage on the Kra Canal.
Counter to. All right. And one more. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So, ma'am, I have a more general observation to make than a question. And it is that, we Indians get a very special pleasure in saying that, China is way ahead of us, or the product that Chinese companies make are way ahead of the ones that we indigenously make. So, and we don't even bother about doing anything about it, So I feel 5G is a very, very good way and an opportunity for us to create a national champion. Because when a Vietnamese company like Viettel can roll out 5G on its own, and as ma'am also said, some of Indian startups in Bangalore are already working on terahertz frequency, which will come in 6G and 7G, not even 5G. So why isn't the Indian government bringing in investment? And also one more question, just one question lastly. How is Mr. Modi thinking of making India a great power when our communication network, very basic thing, is going to be powered by our major adversary China, or any other country for that matter?
Or our cricket team is sponsored by Oppo, you mean? Do you want to, Anirudh, there was one question about Kra, environment, people.
Okay, so I find that's a very interesting question. Thank you so much, sir, for that. So let me begin with talking about the question of how Kra is going to impact the environment. That's a major concern for the Thais as well. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I don't think it's going to materialize anytime soon. If you were to build a Kra Canal, you would essentially be dissuading tourists from ever going to Pattaya ever again. So I don't think the Thais would willingly put that into jeopardy. As to the broader question of how 5G geopolitics and how the Kra Canal might impact climate change, one thing I would definitely like to say is very recently a bunch of scientists wrote a letter, I think it was to the American government, saying that 5G networks are definitely going to impact our understanding of weather patterns. Because the wavelength at which 5G waves operate changes the way that water molecules could potentially mess with weather satellites, which I think is something that world governments should definitely be very concerned about, considering the way that climate change is going to kick in over the coming decades. That said, I don't think world governments care that much about climate change. I'm sorry to be so frank with you, but it seems to me to be a game of technological escalation at this point, where the world knows that 5G is here. Certain world governments are capable of bringing 5G here, and if you do not tap into the economic potential of 5G, you risk being left behind in this economic race. And considering the potential that 5G has to offer, as Manoj said, connecting 2.6 million devices within a square kilometer has massive implications for the digital economy. The risks of not doing that when your competitors are doing it, when China is doing it, I don't think India can afford not to think about it.
I think you meant the environment on the Kra Canal as well.
So I did address that. I don't know if Kragh is going to stop climate change or trigger climate change. As for that point, I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage there. So I'm not aware of the exact status of the project. That said, I do know that within the Andamans, the Navy does have a concrete plan to basically force accretion over the next few decades. They plan to bring in more drones, more surveillance capabilities. My point is that this is something that you need to think about with the idea that eventually, if the Kra Canal is built, you need to be able to block off both the Malacca Straits and to block off the Kra Canal.
Thanks. Manoj, do you want to address it and also give, because the lady over there seemed very well informed, give people a sense of what that British model is, because more and more countries seem to be wanting to talk about what you also said, which is deal with core and critical with one way and people with the other.
Okay, so I knew I was going to get this question, and this is a tricky one to answer. Firstly, I'm not sure if the British know what the British model is. Do they know anything anymore? But anyway, as far as the core and edge goes, so I wouldn't necessarily go into the distinctions, into very hard distinctions, because I'm not a technology guy. But what I can tell you is that there are spaces, there is a part of the network where you will do authorizations, you will do verifications, and you will clarify who comes in, who goes out. That's where we need to keep them out, fundamentally. At the edge services, that's not necessarily a problem. Do we have vulnerabilities at the edge? Of course, yes. There will always be vulnerabilities at the edge. But can you potentially manage them better in terms of, firstly, the size and the scale of the impact of those vulnerabilities is far limited than the vulnerabilities at the core. Secondly, your ability to manage them and the cost to mitigate them will be far more limited as compared to the cost to mitigate compromising your core. So that's broadly where I would keep the distinction in core and edge. Yes, I think in order to be able to identify whether fiber optic cables and how they can play, how those can have an issue in terms of our security and in terms of the data that gets transferred, I agree. I mean, at any level, when you can see what you can't manage or managing what would become extremely expensive and therefore cost inefficient, you would want to keep them out. That's broadly the argument there. In terms of, so that's my sort of response on the core and edge argument. There was another question which spoke about national champions. And the Chinese creating national champions, and even Jabin mentioned this, right? You know, why aren't our companies going abroad, and why isn't Reliance? Yeah. So in that context, if you look at the fact that, sort of the first thing is look at the political economy of India and the political economy of China. They are very, very different, right? We can't necessarily replicate something that they are doing. But what we need, so that's one point, right? We can't necessarily, our government does not come up with a plan and says that we need to achieve this scale in X sector by 2025. And then that launches this entire cascading effect where local governments start to say, oh, I need to please my bosses, which is what happens in the Communist Party. And therefore I need to achieve these scales, and therefore I need to get investments, and therefore I need to raise debt. It doesn't happen that way in India, right? When the Prime Minister in Delhi announces a certain plan, it's not necessarily that the Maharashtra government immediately implements that plan, because the Maharashtra government is it isn't accountable necessarily to the Prime Minister. Neither is the Chief Minister necessarily accountable. Or in the case of Maharashtra, he might be, but in other cases where he is not. So Delhi right now. Okay, you're in Delhi. Yeah. Delhi right now. He's not accountable to the Prime Minister in the way that a party secretary or a governor of, say, Sichuan province is responsible to Beijing. There's a very big difference in that. So the political economy is different. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I empathize with that argument, right? We need to create an ecosystem of innovation generally. It's not just about 5G, it's not just about telecommunications. In general, what we are lacking is an ecosystem of innovation.
Is it true that we have at present on 5G only one patent pending?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's not about taking pleasure in it. It is about counting exactly where we are and having a more realistic.
I just want to explain what I mean by that ecosystem of innovation. It's essentially the linkage between private business, researchers, and the state. And the ability of these three actors to play with each other and to work with each other, to be able to commercialize the research that we are doing, to be able to create products from that. This happens in Silicon Valley. In India, there is a firewall or a Chinese wall between the researchers, between private businesses, between government, and it's all very tenuous. And part of that has to do with this constant sense of corruption, but it also has to do with different people viewing their roles in society differently. The academics will view their role as holier than thou academia. We're not in it for commercialization, we're in it for broader purposes, whereas the private sector will look at immediate commercialization. So that would be my answer to those two.
All right, there was a small question over here about why we are only looking at it from the state's perspective. What about the average person's right to access this technology as well as worry about security and safety?
No, I agree. I think our study looked at it from the state's perspective because what we were looking at was from the state's perspective. It was not necessarily looking at it from the individual's perspective. But I agree with you, privacy and the right to access to some of these things is fundamental. Thankfully, the Supreme Court in India says that privacy is a fundamental right and therefore it's important. So I agree that's an important narrative to take into account.
Okay, the 5-minute placard has gone up, so I'm going to try and take 3 questions from this end since we took the last bunch from there. So go on.
Well, I am an odd man out here, but thanks to Smita that I am here. I am Professor N.K. Goyal. About a few seconds, I represent Telecom associations for the last 48 years. I am dealing with China since 1984. In this background, few things. First, about the patents. Sorry, India doesn't hold a single patent as of now.
We've applied for one 5G patent.
Hold on. So. We applied, but it has been rejected. Yeah. Rejected. And that one patent is a, I don't know, farce kehte na? No, hold on. Whatever I will say, it is documented with the proof.
Sure, sir, go ahead.
It is a farce to say we applied for a patent. The patent is कैसे travel करेगा distance wise वगैरह. वो 3GPP ने reject कर दिया है. Patent is there. Now another point which you referred about the Huawei. I will not take more than 5 minutes. Few points one by one.
We don't have 5 minutes.
1.5.
Very tight.
1.5. Yeah. 1 point. I am always very fast. It is a fact that the patents are held maximum in 5G by Ericsson's. Ericsson's, Nokia, Qualcomm together have 1 lakh patents. Next point comes standards. When the standards were made by 3GPP, the real 5G will be made in 2020. Yeah. They have not so far talked to any user for this. Yeah. There is no demand from automobile or Apollo or somebody. When we talk of cheap things, you will get everything cheap from China if you simply become substitute to China. That is simple. When you said that we have a fund for Indian nations, no fund. We don't have any fund for Indian nations. No. Categorically no. When you said, when speaking about the health part, how much we know that the standards laid down in the world are based on 1998. Nobody in the world has talked of standards for health or risk or cyber for 5G. When it comes to your view about the high debt of telecom, the answer given by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman about few days back in the meeting. You say, this is my last point, that you are having a high customers, low revenue, high debt, but even then you are investing. Why? Is it not a commercial decision? Now, last point, everybody said every country can spook on us. But as was said by Jacob, how many countries have the law which forces Huawei to give me access and data from India?
Very interesting.
Can I just answer?
Yes.
So quickly, I agree with you on the access, the law issue with regard to China. On the debt issue, it is a commercial decision, of course, and the commercial decision is because you're competing in a market where you're looking for capacity, coverage, and quality and market share. On the issue of, there was another point that you made about not just about patents, but you spoke about this fund for indigenization. The point that I was making was that not that a fund has been created, but there is a proposal for a fund for $10 billion which has been proposed. I don't know where that's gone, but it's a proposal that's on the table because the objective that was laid out was to indigenize by 2022, which when I started my presentation, I said the assumption is that we can't do that at the scale that is needed.
Absolutely. And when we talk about it, the fact is we are still talking about technology when we have to get to the infrastructure, we have to make a policy, and then we get to procurement, which is really the Huawei question, right? At the end, do I have 5 minutes to go? Okay, quickly. And questions, all of you. Where's the mic? Is somewhere. Someone there has a mic. Sir, do you...
Hi, I just want to address your point really quickly and say just because other world governments don't care about climate change and aren't intelligent enough to see that doesn't mean that India should not. The long-term implications of air quality in Delhi is worrying enough without adding 5G and like an unknown science. But my main question is, why would you spend $30 billion on a canal? Why would you worry about 5G when the majority of your people, or the majority of India's people, cannot even afford a nice phone? Should the government not be spending its money on education, on poverty and hunger initiatives, and then seeing the growth from the economy that stems from that, instead of worrying about these high-end, industrialized ideas that the majority of your country, is struggling?
Very, very deep question, but we're going to need a separate Ideashala on that. Yeah, go ahead.
My question to Manoj sir. So you mentioned that when telecom companies from China enter India, there should be a whitelist and there should be a set of regulations for them to function. But on the other hand, if you look at companies like Xiaomi, they have increased their production from handsets to earphones and to home appliances. So on that sense, what should these regulations be, and how will we ensure that it doesn't affect our Indian market and our consumer market on a longer term?
Go ahead, next to you.
Hello, sir. My name is Shakti. Japan is still one of the largest infrastructure provider in Southeast Asia. So, do you see India or Japan taking a lead in converting the Quad into an infrastructure alliance for the Kra Canal?
Thank you so much. So I have a quick question that if, as like Manoj sir mentioned, that India, to step out into the world in terms of the telecom industry, we can use a partnership as of now. Then can India see this partnership coming from South Korea, which very recently is known to have launched the first national 5G network, beating US and China? Thank you.
Okay. Why don't you both
Okay, so there are two questions that I would like to answer. First is about the consumer market regulations that we need to have. I mentioned the edge services, which is what you exactly spoke about, your phones, your IoT devices, and all of those. I'm good with Xiaomi, I'm good with Huawei, let them do it, they do it cost efficiently. If they want to do it, and it'd be great if they do it in India, let them create jobs in India to do that. So I'm absolutely good with that, more power to that. From the point of view of South Korea and 5G, more partners the merrier we are. I have no issues with us partnering with South Korea also. It's absolutely great. They have obviously a quality industry in this domain. The US doesn't really have 5G equipment providers, right? They don't have anybody in this domain. It's Europeans and the Chinese and South Koreans. So yeah, we can work with the South Koreans also. Lastly, I just want to underline this issue of health and the idea of why do this when you have so much else to do. You will always have so much else to do. There's always choices to be made. You have to prioritize. You can't stay back and say, until I build toilets in every home, I'm not building telecommunications. You can't do that.
Age-old guns versus butter. And you had something from the previous round.
I would actually, this probably needs a lot more time to address, but it goes back to Javin's question of whether there is no need for 5G, right? Because we have dynamic spectrum restructuring and so on and so forth. Is it okay if I address that?
Yeah,
point?
yeah, please go ahead. That's a minefield I didn't want to step into.
So I'll just make a tentative foray into it, which is namely that again, dynamic spectrum restructuring is looking more at the speed end of things. It's not necessarily looking at the latency end of things. I think the really big win for India in terms of 5G is being able to send a request to a server and getting a response within a fraction of a second. If you look at the way that India responded to TikTok, for example, within the space of a month, you instantly had this huge economy that emerged around TikTok. I think recently somebody in Delhi was actually killed because of his popularity on TikTok or something like that. But the broader point I'm trying to make is not that people should be killed for using TikTok, but rather that India's potential in terms of using the digital economy is absolutely massive. And at least for me, I think from a strategic perspective, it makes absolute sense to bring as much data to as many Indians as you possibly can as fast as possible.
No. After. You want to answer some of these questions, including the Kra Canal, India, Japan?
The question of whether India should partner with the Quad for doing this, I think it doesn't address the broader question of, do the Thais really want the Kra Canal as much as we think they do? And I don't think that I think that for at least the broad sweep of history shows us that whenever there's competition between two powers in Southeast Asia, the Thais are very happy to say, we're thinking of building a canal, because it gets them concessions from both sides. If Japan were open to the idea of India building a Kra Canal with the Quad, I think it's definitely a good idea. But do I think that they're actually going to do that? Not necessarily.
In fact, the real worry for them is what you were talking about a little bit, is that the gap between the North and South will become even more pronounced, and they don't want to allow for that. Look, this has been fascinating for me, and thank you so much to both of you for bringing presentations that really made sense and brought an immediacy to it. I want to remind you that even as we sit over here, there in Osaka, all of these issues are in fact being discussed at the G20. And Jabin, thanks so much for weighing in and bringing, as usual, that little dose of cold water for all of us. We must remember his words when he says we shan't lose our heads in the middle of it all. But I invite you to continue this conversation over coffee and tea that follows. Thanks so much for inviting us here.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been the responsibility has been handed over to me to give a vote of thanks before the program is ended. This is the first time doing it midway through, but there are people to thank, no doubt. Firstly, I'm delighted to see the turnout here. I see a lot of friends and associates who are practitioners, people engaged in policy, academia, media. So really happy to see all of that. And especially delighted to see the turnout amongst younger people, especially from the universities from across Delhi NCR. I think we got representation from Delhi University, JNU, Jamia, OP Jindal Global University. I'd like to also thank Global Youth and The Citizen, two organizations that have helped in encouraging the younger students to come in. And of course, the International Summer School New Delhi, which has participation from almost 15 different countries and universities such as the University of California, Oxford, and South Asian University. So delighted to have you all over here. The Ideashala, of course, places a great impetus on youth. I think this is something that Nitin, in fact, had stressed upon when I had first met him. And so I think to see this particular gathering exceptionally pleases us. A big thank you to Nitin. I think it was his concept to get this gathering together. And the opportunity to work with Takshashila Institution. I'd like to thank them all. Manoj has been especially involved in this and has helped give this shape. It's been a pleasure working with him. And of course with Pranay, he's been sort of behind the scenes, but I know how crucial he's been. And Anirudh, who I've had the privilege of meeting more recently. The biggest gratitude is reserved for ICWA and Ambassador Raghavan. I think when I met him first to just explain this concept, without batting an eyelid, which is, I think, what Nitin had also said about when he started Takshashila. He said, yes, I think the connection that Nitin and him have from Singapore helped, of course. Then subsequently, Mrs. Nutan Mahawar, the Joint Secretary of ICWA, has been guiding us throughout. And Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, who you've had an introduction to, has been helping on a daily basis with bringing us all together. My colleagues here in Delhi, with Khalid and his team, they do quite a lot of challenging work along with me. This is one of the more exciting initiatives that we're involved in, and I'd like to thank them for all their efforts. Thank you to the panel led by Suhasini, who moderated. She's a dear friend and mentor. In fact, she is the one who first orchestrated a meeting between me and Nitin, and it has resulted in this particular Ideashala. Dr. Joseph, of course, you have your initial comments have really set the ball rolling in terms of what turned out to be quite a fascinating discussion. And Manoj and Anirudh, I'd like to congratulate you on your presentations and your papers, and I hope that everyone here has read it. Just concluding with 2 points, or 3 requests, I would actually say. I would like to request you to join us for tea outside in the foyer, which has been very kindly organized by ICWA. And please keep the conversations going. I think this is just a start, and we need to keep these conversations going, and especially students, if you go back to your universities and explain this, we'd be most appreciative. At 12 o'clock, when you hear Pranay hit the gong, I'm pretty sure, I'd like to request 2 gatherings. One will be in this particular room, and that's all the students, whether you're from the International Summer School or from any university from across Delhi, who's been invited to participate in this Ideashala. And you will be having a session with Nitin. And I just glimpsed through the presentation or the slides that he has. It's not a PowerPoint, but I think he's going to use them as a tool. But you're in for something pretty exciting. And secondly, the people who have been, the experts who've been invited to take part in the roundtable, I'd request everyone to firstly gather in the conference room, which is just down the hall. And from there, we will be looking at the 2 topics. One, of course, on Kra Canal in the wider Indian Ocean region, and the second on 5G. I'm sure that that's going to be something quite exciting. I'd like to remind the experts that in those roundtables that we'll be following Chatham House rules. An explanation on that might be given on the agenda. And with that, lastly, thank you all for being here and entrusting us with your time and taking the time to be here. Thank you, sir.
T.C.A.